Okay, well, so really enjoyed these last two talks, lots of great information. I'm a scientist, I don't treat people, never had a patient, so I'm not going to be giving medical advice, but I'm giving my own personal take on what I think can help you stay healthy and perhaps even help you get over some of the symptoms of long COVID or vaccine injury. So my title is Long COVID and Post-Vaccine Syndrome, Symptoms, Mechanisms, and Treatment Options. And so I like to start with a quote. So fasting and eating a truly healthy, balanced, and thoughtful diet may be as important as the therapeutics we take in keeping the spike protein at bay. I certainly believe this, and so a lot of my advice will be nutritional. So here's an outline, a brief overview, very short overview to start with. And then I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail about exosomes. And I'm not talking about therapeutic exosomes, although those are very, very interesting. And I've been following that research recently. These are actually exosomes that your body produces that communicate with all the other cells in your body. And these exosomes, I think, are very important in transmitting the toxic spike protein throughout your body. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about mechanisms of toxicity of the spike protein. And then treatment options, a long section on treatment options, mostly treatment in quotes because it's not therapeutic in the sense of prescription drugs. And then finally a summary. So brief overview. This slide shows a list of symptoms here. This is a great article if you want to know the distribution of the symptoms that people are seeing from long COVID. This was a good study with a lot of patients. And they organized things by counts. And so you can see the things at the top up there. Do I have a pointer? I don't have a pointer, I guess. At the top is fatigue, headache, attention disorder, hair loss, labored breathing, loss of a sense of taste and smell, very rapid breathing, and then lesser amounts of joint pain, cough, sweat, chest pain, nausea, and memory loss. So this is really quite an extensive list of symptoms, and you've heard that from the other speakers, all the different symptoms that their patients are encountering. A very strange condition. So why the mRNA vaccines? I'm going to do it this way. Why the mRNA vaccines are more likely to cause damage to the organs than an infection. The infection begins in the lungs. It's outside of the blood-brain barrier. It's outside of the vascular barrier as well as being outside of the blood vein, or the outside of both. It's in the outside of the body, basically. The mucosal barrier and the blood-brain barrier are both not penetrated when the virus first comes into the lungs, whereas the vaccine is injected in the arm muscle past both of those barriers, the vascular barrier and the mucosal barrier, directly into the muscle. And that's going to turn out to be very important. It's also, of course, the RNA has been configured in a very interesting way with all these methylpseudouridines that you heard about. Very important because that makes it very hard for the natural enzymes that would break it down to do so. And so it sticks around for a really long time. We heard 2 months, longer than 2 months because they stopped looking at that point. Most RNA that's produced naturally disappears in a few hours. So this is very unusual behavior of this mRNA. And now the really important thing, in my opinion, is this part that's lit up in red. Muscle cells take up the nanoparticles and they synthesize large quantities of spike protein, and then they release it along with other interesting messenger molecules, and they package it up inside these exosomes and they release it. And then that, along with the cationic lipid that's included in the vaccine, is also put into those exosomes. And these exosomes are released and distributed throughout the body through multiple channels. And so the spike protein causes an inflammatory response wherever it goes, potentially leading to neurodegenerative disease and heart damage. So the problems with this vaccine spike protein, it's possible. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my glasses. So, is it possible the spike protein itself causes tissue damage associated with COVID-19? This is a comment by this Patrick Whelan, MD, PhD. And so he's proposing, we know there's this furin cleavage site which breaks off the S1 piece, and the S1 piece has the receptor binding domain, which binds to the ACE2 receptor and causes trouble with any cell that has ACE2 receptors. And so it's a potent neurotoxin. And so that S1 subunit alone is capable of being taken up by the endothelial cells in both the human and the mouse brain. And then that can cause an encephalitis reaction that can be the basis for the neurological complications of COVID-19. So I think this is really an important point, that the neurons are being attacked, and most of these symptoms that we're seeing are neurological in nature. So exosomes, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein activates human microglia in the brain via exosomes that are loaded with microRNAs. And this is a very important paper by these two people from India, published in 2021. And they did a really interesting study where they exposed human cells in culture essentially to the vaccine. They took up the mRNA, they started making spike protein, and they observed that they packaged up into exosomes and released them. And those exosomes contained other contents besides the spike protein that would influence the behavior of cells that took them up. So this is a communication network among the cells that's really telling the entire body, I've got this toxin I'm dealing with, I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to have to deal with it too. And here's some hints about how to deal with it that include a reaction that can be very inflammatory and damaging to the brain. So they took those exosomes and they gave them to microglia, which are the immune cells of the brain. And those cells then took up the exosomes and became activated and introduced an inflammatory response that would then injure the brain. So this is a picture of the situation with exosomes. There's a donor cell over here. It releases those exosomes, and they have all this interesting content. You can see up there, there's a big list of things, including the microRNAs, which are signaling molecules, the mRNA, the actual mRNA that makes the spike protein, and the spike protein itself is displayed on the surface. That spike protein is neurotoxic and also amyloidogenic. It can cause misfolding of other proteins. So a very dangerous situation with that, those exosomes being taken up by a receiver cell. And this is a very important paper about the muscle. So I was looking at exosomes, studying papers in the literature to see what we know about exosomes. And it was quite educational to me to see that muscle cells in particular actually release exosomes under normal circumstances. And some of those are actually released into the synapse, and they're taken up by the axon of the motor neuron that controls the muscle. And so this can cause, and that's for nutritional as well as informational communication with that axon. And so this is a natural process, but when the muscle is being injected with this vaccine, this natural process gets contaminated with the spike protein. And then the axon takes up the spike protein and the motor neuron gets damaged. And so these exosomes are released and distributed throughout the body to other organs through this process. And the evidence is accumulating that the cargo of the muscle-derived exosomes can be changed under pathological conditions. And those exosomes contribute to the propagation of the pathogenic response to distant cells. So in other words, the muscle, it doesn't stay in the muscle. It goes all over the body. And I think the main mechanism by which it does that is through these exosomes. And so this is another paper that shows these exosomes and toxicants. And here it has heavy metals, pesticides, ionizing radiation, cigarette smoke, toxic chemicals, all those things. When a cell is exposed to them, it releases the exosomes. And with this microRNA and with misfolded proteins, if they have things that are going to cause proteins to misfold. And that's going to be misfolded spike protein because that protein is a prion-like protein. And then they have all these different signaling molecules and a lipid membrane. These exosomes are really fancy and very talented in terms of what they can do to convey information around the body. But when they are contaminated with toxins, it becomes a very different story. And so this is my proposal, that you have the muscle cell over here at the bottom, and it's been injected with a toxin, and those little red circles are the exosomes traveling up the axon to the motor neuron that's in the spinal cord, the motor neuron that excites that muscle to make it contract. And then from there, that motor neuron actually transmits them a second relay up to the brain stem and hits those centers in the brain that control things like breathing and consciousness and blood pressure and heart rate. So those neurons can get disturbed and damaged by the spike protein that has traveled from the muscle to the brain outside of the blood. It never made it to the blood. So it doesn't have to get past the blood-brain barrier. It's already passed from the get-go. And I think this is a very important point that I believe is a mechanism by which you're seeing all this neurological damage. We're seeing neuroinflammation and all kinds of different neuropathologies associated with this long COVID or this vaccine injury. And so people, I think, who are particularly have strong arm muscles are going to be more vulnerable to damage from the vaccine because those axons are better developed and there's much more flow of exosomes normally through that system that are going to more efficiently deliver the spike protein to the brain. And so this is just, again, another paper. These are papers from before COVID. I found a couple of them that were talking about other proteins that were being put into, they were experimenting with nanoparticles, with these human proteins that they put into the nanoparticle. And so essentially the vaccine is experimenting to see what happens. And they demonstrated experimentally that one cell, the cell that picks up the nanoparticles, spits out those exosomes. They can go to another cell, the other cell can take them up, and this other cell can start making protein from the mRNA that's in the exosome. So this means that the spike protein code is being distributed throughout the body, I think in many respects traveling along nerve fibers and reaching all the nerves of the body and causing a tremendous amount of damage to the nervous system. And so this is another paper with a human protein that is VEGF-A. So they're experimenting with putting these human proteins into nanoparticles and delivering to the people, and demonstrating again that the receptor cell is able to produce protein from the RNA that was packaged up by the original cell into the exosomes. So I think this is a perfect mechanism for the natural cellular system to distribute the contents of the nanoparticles in a way that's actually more dangerous than the original nanoparticles, because it's completely disguised as a natural human thing that the body knows how to deal with, knows how to take them up, and then gets all of these nasty reactions through the distribution of the spike protein and the messenger RNA. So this is one about Parkinson's disease, and this was a paper that I wrote together with Greg Nye. It was the first paper that I published on the vaccines, and we showed how the spike protein could cause Parkinson's disease. And we looked at the history of Parkinson's and how they show that it works in the gut with misfolded proteins that are prion-like from pathogens that then get picked up by the immune system, taken to the spleen, and then they can travel along nerve fibers. So the important thing is this is, again, exosomes traveling along nerve fibers to get from the spleen via the vagus nerve, again, to the brain. So this is another pathway by which exosomes can carry the spike protein to the brain along nerve pathways, starting with the gut and starting with the pathogens in the gut. But in our case, it can be starting with the immune cells that go to the spleen from the muscle. And it's been shown that the spleen has the highest level of spike protein contamination in the tracer studies of the vaccine. So the spleen ends up with a lot of spike protein in the immune cells, and then again the exosomes are released and they travel up to the brain via the vagus nerve. And then you get this misfolding of another protein, alpha-synuclein, which is associated with Parkinson's disease. And the alpha-synuclein is produced in the spleen. And this is shown experimentally with Parkinson's. Produced in the spleen, misfolded in the spleen, because of these pathogenic amyloidogenic proteins in the pathogens. The spike protein does the same thing. And that's going to cause Parkinson's disease potentially in a vulnerable person. And so this was an article that talked about, is COVID-19 a perfect storm for Parkinson's disease? And this indicated that it affects the sense of smell and sense of taste. That's a well-known early symptom of Parkinson's disease, is to have a loss of a sense of smell. And so the virus, this is talking about the virus, and it can gain access along the olfactory nerve. So that's similar to the vagus nerve, or it can come up from the vagus nerve from the stomach, and so hit the brain, go to this brain center that controls where Parkinson's disease occurs. And that center has these neurons that have a lot of ACE2 receptors, so they can pick up the spike protein delivered by exosomes, even as well as the virus itself. And so 3 independent case reports have reported Parkinson's disease following COVID-19. Mechanisms of toxicity. So this is just showing that the spike protein is amyloidogenic. It causes other proteins to misfold, and that's going to cause a lot of different neurodegenerative diseases. It binds to heparin, And then in binding to heparin, it gets these other proteins to also bind to heparin, kind of brings them together, and that's when they misfold, when they become highly concentrated. So the spike protein can promote the misfolding of alpha-synuclein, amyloid beta, the various proteins that misfold in association with neurodegenerative diseases. The spike protein can accelerate the rate at which they misfold and accelerate the rate of progression of those diseases. So this is a paper on the vascular effects of the spike protein. And again, they mention these extracellular vesicles, which are basically exosomes, that they create a catalytic surface for clotting factors. So the exosomes are being released by the infected cells. This is a blood vessel, and it's got endothelial linings, cells lining it. The extracellular vesicles are then going to trigger the misfolding and then the coagulation factors that are going to cause the blood clots. And then this is about vagus nerve inflammation, contributing to dysautonomia. How do you say that? Dysautonomia in association with long COVID, and that's a classic feature of the vaccine injury as well as the long COVID, is this dysregulation of the autonomic system that controls the blood pressure and the heart rate and all of those things, consciousness. And so all these symptoms that are associated with long COVID can be explained by inflammation of the vagus nerve, which is a major nerve that connects up the brain with all these different organs in your body. And so I think that's a very good pathway for the exosomes to travel along to get the infection all across the body. And so this is some data on, well, here's a paper that talks about a particular list of symptoms that are characteristic of vagus nerve inflammation. They listed up here, and I've got those same symptoms in this chart where I looked up the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting Database, the system that the government maintains, for the year 2021. And I looked at all the counts for these symptoms: diarrhea, tachycardia, dizziness, dysphagia, dysphonia, and orthostatic hypotension. So these are various symptoms that were listed in this paper associated with vagus nerve damage. And when you look at the counts of the number of cases where these things are reported in VAERS over that year, you find that almost all of the cases are associated with COVID-19 vaccines. Way, way more. The remaining cases, for example, the tachycardia, 97.7%, 98% of the cases are COVID vaccines, and 2% are all the other vaccines put together that were given that year. It's way, way more than the percentage of vaccines that were COVID vaccines. And this is just a larger chart that's from this paper that I published together with colleagues, Food and Chemical Toxicology, where we discussed this vagus nerve story, and we showed all these symptoms that are connected to the vagus nerve, and many of them, especially, for example, anosmia is highlighted in red there because it was 99.5% of the cases were COVID, with only 0.5% for all the other vaccines. So very strong evidence of the vaccine affecting the vagus nerve, and that relates to all these symptoms that you see in association with long COVID. Okay, so now comes treatment options. This will get a little easier, a lot less science. I hope you'll appreciate that. So these are just the things I'm going to talk about in the coming slides that I've sort of zeroed in on as being things that would be fairly easy to change your lifestyle to accommodate them. And my preference is for choosing foods that are rich in these nutrients rather than for taking supplements that contain them in general. And that includes getting out in the sunlight rather than taking a vitamin D supplement. And so these are the ones I'll discuss. Melatonin, of course, that's been talked about before. Very, very healthy antioxidant and helps you sleep. Tryptophan is a precursor to melatonin. That's an amino acid. Vitamin K, and especially vitamin K2, omega-3 fats. Taurine, which is an unusual sulfur-containing amino acid. It's the only sulfonated amino acid. And then of these various antioxidants, quercetin, resveratrol, curcumin. Intermittent fasting, that was also brought up earlier. Sunlight, and then organic diet. So really interesting to me, this paper that showed that when the immune cells, when the macrophages get activated by an infection, they actually switch their metabolism from using their mitochondria to producing their energy through glycolysis. And when they do this, they no longer make melatonin. So normally, most of the cells in your body make their own melatonin, which is quite interesting, and it wasn't something I was aware of until recently. They make melatonin and they use it to protect their mitochondria from oxidative damage. But when their mitochondria aren't working, their amount of melatonin that they make goes way down. And so you need to perhaps supplement the melatonin to compensate for the loss of the natural melatonin that's being produced by the immune cells and by all the cells. So here are some actual foods that are good sources of melatonin. You can just get the melatonin from your food. Those are goji berries up there at the right, and cherries and eggs, nuts, fish, which of course we have a lot of fish here, and milk, dairy. Now tryptophan, of course, is a precursor to melatonin. Your body makes melatonin. It makes tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin, and serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. So tryptophan can give you both serotonin and melatonin, which are very important bioactive molecules in your body. And it's also a precursor to nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NAD, which is a very important molecule in the oxidative reductive reactions. And so there are many wonderful foods that are rich in tryptophan. You can see here again the fish. Fish is really comes on the list. Most of the things I recommend are in fish, which makes fish a very healthy diet, which is fortunate for us because we have a lot of wonderful fish in Hawaii. Fish and chocolate, and that's prunes and oatmeal there, and cheese, turkey. Turkey is a very good source of tryptophan. Nuts and bananas and milk again. So some of these overlap with the melatonin. Reduced vitamin K status. It's a potentially modifiable risk factor of severe COVID. Patients with severe COVID are more likely to have type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. These things are all associated with vitamin K2 deficiency. And there's this protein called matrix GLA, which depends upon vitamin K2, and it's reduced in association with the deficiencies. And it's been shown to be, it protects from arterial calcification. And it was studied, a study on 123 patients with COVID compared to controls showed that the patients had reduced levels of this matrix GLA. And those with the worst outcome had even lower levels than those with the milder symptoms. So that's very clear that K2 is a very good benefactor, helping to protect you from long COVID. So here are some foods that contain K2, and you can see the fermented foods like sauerkraut, our favorite natto, which is really takes a lot of getting used to be able to eat, but that's a very healthy food in Japan. So fermented foods, beef liver, hard cheese, avocado, and then mustard greens. So a little bit of some of the greens, healthy greens. And natto, of course, contains natto kinase, which is this enzyme that can break down the spike protein. So that gives you extra benefit from taking natto. Omega-3 fatty acids. They are useful for resolving inflammation. They're actually, they respond with lipoxygenase is an enzyme that converts them into signaling molecules called resolvins, which will tame the inflammatory response. And promote the clearance of those inflammatory cells that are causing the damage. So there's a protocol that recommends this is the FLCCC, recommends this protocol of 4 grams per day of these products. The EPA, DHA are the major long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. And then these products, Vascepa and Lovasa, which are sort of, I think, prescription drugs that have that as well. I would suggest eating foods that are rich in omega-3s over taking pills. And again, that's going to be fish. So fish is a really good choice for that. Here's some food sources of omega-3s. Some of our repeats from before. So these healthy greens and seafood. Seafood is a very healthy source of lots of nutrients, mussels and oysters and clams, and seeds and nuts, fish, and especially sardines. Oh, and then grass-fed butter. I want to add that to this list. They didn't show it here, but grass-fed butter is a really good source of omega-3 fats. And then, of course, sardines are wonderful, and this just has a quote from this article. They provide 2 grams of omega-3s per 3-ounce serving, and that's one of the highest levels we can see, with the lowest level of mercury in fish. And so they contain a great source of calcium and vitamin D as well. So sardines are really good food to eat. And this is taurine. I love taurine. It's the only sulfonated amino acid. You can take it as a supplement, but it's also found in a lot of foods. Its abundance decreases with age. It's most common isolated amino acid in the body. It doesn't go into protein, so it's very unusual that way. But it gets accumulated in the heart and the liver and the brain. And in foods, it's only available from animal-based foods, except for one exception, which is nori, the seaweed that goes into Japanese sushi. That's the only vegetable source of taurine. It protects from DNA damage, suppresses inflammation, protects the mitochondria from damage, which is very important for the energy. And mice that are supplemented with taurine live longer and have a stronger immune system. And I said this, it's only sulfonated amino acid, which is a very important aspect of its health benefits. So here's some foods that contain taurine. Again, the seafood, the tuna, ahi, wonderful fish here, contains lots of taurine. Nori, if you eat Japanese sushi, you're getting a good source of nori, both from the seafood that's in the sushi as well as the nori. And turkey, again, and chicken livers. So this is a paper about all these different nutritional supplements that are sort of medicinal herbs, and a few of the common ones are listed on the right: quercetin, curcumin, resveratrol, various spices. I'd encourage people to put lots of herbs and spices into their food when they're cooking, because those are very helpful to keep your immune system healthy. And this shows in particular that they can help to prevent the misfolding of the proteins that causes these neurodegenerative diseases. Intermittent fasting, routine periodic fasting was actually shown to be a benefit. If you practiced that before you got COVID, you had a milder case. It suppresses inflammatory cytokines. Fatty acids are increased, so you have a higher level of these fatty acids in your blood with fasting, and those can actually help to block the spike protein from binding to the ACE2 receptor. Ketogenic diets that cause a switch of energy source from glucose to fatty acids could also provide a similar benefit. So eating a very high-fat diet. And then it can enhance autophagy, which can help to clear the spike protein. So spend time outdoors in the sun. That's easy to do here. I think that it's hard to get too much sunlight, especially if you develop a good tan, you actually have natural protection, and you wouldn't need to use the sunscreen. Vitamin D deficiencies is significantly associated with increased risk for COVID-19. And so go organic, that's my favorite spiel. As people probably know, I've been studying glyphosate extensively. That's the active ingredient in Roundup. It's all over the food supply. Eating organic can greatly reduce your exposure to glyphosate, and I believe glyphosate is a factor in causing more severe disease in association with COVID-19. So finally, a summary. Long COVID and post-vaccine syndrome are closely related. The spike protein, I think, is a primary factor in both diseases. It's neurotoxic and it's prion-like. It can cause other proteins to misfold. Exosomes play a major role in its distribution, not just through the blood, but also through the nervous system. And they travel along nerve fibers to reach the spinal cord and ultimately to reach the brain centers that control important regulatory factors. Many nutritional deficiencies are linked to long COVID. They include omega-3 fats, vitamins K and D, taurine, which is, again, sulfur. Other sulfur-containing foods are also recommended: melatonin, tryptophan, fermented foods. And then periodic fasting, sunlight exposure, and organic diet are all beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think everyone should know Stephanie was one of the first people in the country, one of the scientists who was talking about the difficulties with these vaccines when everyone else from the start and some still saying safe and effective like a mantra. She was one of the early people who were bringing out those facts that there are questions, there are problems, and so that's, we thank you very much for that.